Albert Ostman's story. I have always followed logging and construction work. This time I had worked over 1 year on a construction job, and thought a good vacation was in order. BC is famous for lost gold mines. One is supposed to be at the head of Toba Inlet. Why not look for this mine and have a vacation at the same time? I took the Union steamship boat to Lund, BC. From there I hired an old Indian to take me to the head of Toba Inlet. This old Indian was a very talkative old gentleman. He told me stories about gold brought out by a white man from this lost mine. This white man was a very heavy drinker, spent his money freely in saloons. But he had no trouble in getting more money. He would be away a few days, then come back with a bag of gold. But one time he went to his mine and never came back. Some people said a Sasquatch had killed him. At that time I had never heard of Sasquatch. So I asked what kind of an animal he called a Sasquatch. The Indian said, they have hair all over their bodies, but they are not animals. They are people. Big people living in the mountains. My uncle saw the tracks of one that were 2 feet long. One old Indian saw one over 8 feet tall. I told the Indian I didn't believe in their old fables about mountain giants. It might have been some thousands of years ago, but not nowadays. The Indian said, there may not be many, but they still exist. We arrived at the head of the inlet about 4 p.m. I made camp at the mouth of a creek. The Indian had supper with me, and I told him to look out for me in about 3 weeks. I would be camping at the same spot when I came back. Next morning I took my rifle with me, but left my equipment at the camp. I decided to look around for some deer trail to lead me up into the mountains. On the way up the inlet I had seen a pass in the mountain that I wanted to go through, to see what was on the other side. I spent most of the forenoon looking for a trail but found none, except for a hogback running down to the beach. So I swamped out a trail from there, got back to my camp about 3 p.m. that afternoon, and made up my pack to be ready in the morning. My equipment consisted of one .30 Winchester rifle. I had a special homemade prospecting pick, axe on one end, pick on the other. I had a leather case for this pick which fastened to my belt, also my sheath knife. The storekeeper at Lund was cooperative. He gave me some cans for my sugar, salt and matches to keep them dry. My grub consisted mostly of canned stuff, except for a side of bacon, a bag of beans, 4 pounds of prunes and 6 packets of macaroni, cheese, 3 pounds of pancake flour and 6 packets of Rye King hardtack, 3 rolls of snuff, 1 quart sealer of butter and 2 1-pound cans of milk. I had 2 boxes of shells for my rifle. The storekeeper gave me a biscuit tin. I put a few things in that and cached it under a windfall, so I would have it when I came back here waiting for a boat to bring me out. My sleeping bag I rolled up and tied on top of my pack sack, together with my ground sheet, small frying pan, and 1 aluminum pot that held about a gallon. As my canned food was used, I would get plenty of empty cans to cook with. The following morning I had an early breakfast, made up my pack, and started out up this hogback. My pack must have been at least 80 pounds, besides my rifle. After 1 hour, I had to rest. I kept resting and climbing all that morning. About 2 p.m. I came to a flat place below a rock bluff. There was a bunch of willow in one place. I made a wooden spade and started digging for water. About a foot down I got seepings of water, so I decided to camp here for the night and scout around for the best way to get on from here. I must have been up to near 1,000 feet. There was a most beautiful view over the islands and the strait, tugboats with log booms, and fishing boats going in all directions. A lovely spot. I spent the following day prospecting round. But no sign of minerals. I found a deer trail leading towards this pass that I had seen on my way up the inlet. The following morning I started out early, while it was cool. It was steep climbing with my heavy pack. After a 3 hours climb, I was tired and stopped to rest. On the other side of a ravine from where I was resting was a yellow spot below some small trees. I moved over there and started digging for water. I found a small spring and made a small trough from cedar bark and got a small amount of water, had my lunch and rested here, till evening. I made it over the pass late that night. Now I had downhill and good going, but I was hungry and tired, so I camped at the first bunch of trees I came to. I was trying to size up the terrain, what direction I would take from here. Towards west would lead to low land and some other inlet, so I decided to go in a northeast direction, had good going and slight downhill all day. I must have made 10 miles when I came to a small spring and a big black hemlock tree. This was a lovely campsite. I spent 2 days here just resting and prospecting. The first night here I shot a small deer. 2 days later, I found an exceptionally good campsite. It was 2 good-sized cypress trees growing close together and near a rock wall with a nice spring just below these trees. I intended to make this my permanent camp. I cut lots of brush for my bed between these trees. I rigged up a pole from this rock wall to hang my pack-sack on, and I arranged some flat rocks for my fireplace for cooking. I had a really classy setup. And that is when things began to happen. I am a heavy sleeper, not much disturbs me after I go to sleep, especially on a good bed like I had now. Next morning I noticed things had been disturbed during the night. But nothing missing I could see. I roasted my grouse on a stick for breakfast. That night I filled up the magazine of my rifle. I still had 1 full box of 20 shells and 6 shells in my coat pocket. That night I laid my rifle under the edge of my sleeping bag. I thought a porcupine had visited me the night before and porkies like leather, so I put my shoes in the bottom of my sleeping bag. Next morning my pack sack had been emptied out. Someone had turned the sack upside down. It was still hanging on the pole from the shoulder straps as I had hung it up. Then I noticed 1/2 pound package of prunes was missing. Also my pancake flour was missing, but my salt bag was not touched. Porkies always look for salt, so I decided it must be something else than porkies. I looked for tracks but found none. I did not think it was a bear. They always tear up and make a mess of things. I kept close to camp these days in case this visitor would come back. I climbed up on a big rock where I had a good view of the camp, but nothing showed up. I was hoping it would be a porky, so I would get a good porky stew. These visits had now been going on for 3 nights. This night it was cloudy and looked like it might rain. I took special notice of how everything was arranged. I closed my pack sack. I did not undress, I only took off my shoes, put them in the bottom of my sleeping bag. I drove my prospecting pick into one of the cypress trees so I could reach it from my bed. I also put the rifle alongside me, inside my sleeping bag. I fully intended to stay awake all night to find out who my visitor was, but I must have fallen asleep. I was awakened by something picking me up. I was half asleep and at first I did not remember where I was. As I began to get my wits together, I remembered I was on this prospecting trip, and in my sleeping bag. My first thought was, it must be a snow slide, but there was no snow around my camp. Then it felt like I was tossed on horseback, but I could feel whoever it was walking. I tried to reason out what kind of animal this could be. I tried to get at my sheath knife, and cut my way out, but I was in an almost sitting position, and the knife was under me. I could not get hold of it, but the rifle was in front of me. I had a good hold of that, and had no intention to let go of it. At times I could feel my pack-sack touching me, and could feel the cans in the sack touching my back. After what seemed like an hour, I could feel we were going up a steep hill. I could feel myself rise for every step. What was carrying me was breathing hard and sometimes gave a slight cough. Now, I knew this must be one of the mountain Sasquatch giants the Indian told me about. I was in a very uncomfortable position, unable to move. I was sitting on my feet, and one of the boots in the bottom of the bag was crossways with the hobnail sole up across my foot. It hurt me terribly, but I could not move. It was very hot inside. It was lucky for me this fellow's hand was not big enough to close up the whole bag when he picked me up. There was a small opening at the top, otherwise I would have choked to death. Now he was going downhill. I could feel myself touching the ground at times, and at one time he dragged me behind him and I could feel he was below me. Then he seemed to get on level ground and was going at a trot for a long time. By this time, I had cramps in my legs, the pain was terrible. I was wishing he would get to his destination soon. I could not stand this type of transportation much longer. Now he was going uphill again. It did not hurt me so bad. I tried to estimate distance and directions. As near as I could guess, we were about 3 hours traveling. I had no idea when he started, as I was asleep when he picked me up. Finally he stopped and let me down. Then he dropped my pack sack. I could hear the cans rattle. Then I heard chatter, some kind of talk I did not understand. The ground was sloping, so when he let go of my sleeping bag, I rolled downhill. I got my head out, and got some air. I tried to straighten my legs and crawl out, but my legs were numb. It was still dark, I could not see what my captors looked like. I tried to massage my legs to get some life in them, and get my shoes on. I could hear now it was at least 4 of them. They were standing around me, and continuously chattering. I had never heard of Sasquatch before the Indian told me about them. But I knew I was right among them. But how to get away from them, that was another question. I got to see the outline of them now, as it began to get lighter, though the sky was cloudy, and it looked like rain. In fact, there was a slight sprinkle. I now had circulation in my legs, but my left foot was very sore on top where it had been resting on my hobnail boots. I got my boots out from the sleeping bag and tried to stand up. I found that I was wobbly on my feet, but I had a good hold of my rifle. I asked, "What you fellows want with me?" Only some more chatter. It was getting lighter now, and I could see them quite clearly. I could make out forms of 4 people. 2 big and 2 little ones. They were all covered with hair and no clothes on at all. I could now make out mountains all around me. I looked at my watch. It was 4:25 a.m. It was getting lighter now and I could see the people clearly. They looked like a family, old man, old lady and 2 young ones, a boy and a girl. The boy and the girl seemed to be scared of me. The old lady did not seem too pleased about what the old man dragged home. But the old man was waving his arms and telling them all what he had in mind. They all left me then. I had my compass and my prospecting glass on strings around my neck. The compass in my left-hand shirt pocket and my glass in my right-hand pocket. One tried to reason our location, and where I was. I could see now that I was in a small valley or basin about 8 or 10 acres, surrounded by high mountains. On the southeast side there was a V-shaped opening about 8 feet wide at the bottom and about 20 feet high at the highest point. That must be the way I came in. But how will I get out? The old man was now sitting near this opening. I moved my belongings up close to the west wall. There were 2 small cypress trees there, and this will do for a shelter for the time being. Until I find out what these people want with me, and how to get away from here. I emptied out my packsack to see what I had left in the line of food. All my canned meat and vegetables were intact and I had 1 can of coffee. Also 3 small cans of milk, 2 packages of Rye King hardtack and my butter sealer half full of butter. But my prunes and macaroni were missing. Also my full box of shells for my rifle. I had my sheath knife but my prospecting pick was missing and my can of matches. I only had my safety box full and that held only about a dozen matches. That did not worry me. I can always start a fire with my prospecting glass when the sun is shining, if I got dry wood. I wanted hot coffee, but I had no wood, also nothing around here that looked like wood. I had a good look over the valley from where I was, but the boy and girl were always watching me from behind some juniper bush. I decided there must be some water around here. The ground was leaning towards the opening in the wall. There must be water at the upper end of this valley. There is green grass and moss along the bottom. All my utensils were left behind. I opened my coffee tin and emptied the coffee in a dish towel and tied it with the metal strip from the can. I took my rifle and the can and went looking for water. Right at the head under a cliff there was a lovely spring that disappeared underground. I got a drink, and a full can of water. When I got back, the young boy was looking over my belongings, but did not touch anything. On my way back I noticed where these people were sleeping. On the east side wall of this valley was a shelf in the mountainside, with overhanging rock, looking something like a big undercut in a big tree about 10 feet deep and 30 feet wide. The floor was covered with lots of dry moss, and they had some kind of blankets woven of narrow strips of cedar bark, packed with dry moss. They looked very practical and warm, with no need of washing. The first day not much happened. I had to eat my food cold. The young fellow was coming nearer me, and seemed curious about me. My one snuff box was empty, so I relied it toward him. When he saw it coming, he sprang up quick as a cat, and grabbed it. He went over to his sister and showed her. They found out how to open and close it. They spent a long time playing with it, then he trotted over to the old man and showed him. They had a long chatter. Next morning, I made up my mind to leave this place, if I had to shoot my way out. I could not stay much longer. I had only enough grub to last me till I got back to Toba Inlet. I did not know the direction, but I would go downhill and I would come out near civilization someplace. I rolled up my sleeping bag, put that inside my pack sack, packed the few cans I had, swung the sack on my back, injected the shell in the barrel of my rifle and started for the opening in the wall. The old man got up, held up his hands as though he would push me back. I pointed to the opening. I wanted to go out. But he stood there pushing towards me, and said something that sounded like, "Saw-ka, saw-ka." I backed up to about 60 feet. I did not want to be too close, I thought, if I had to shoot my way out. A 30 might not have much effect on this fellow, it might make him mad. I only had 6 shells, so I decided to wait. There must be a better way than killing him, in order to get out from here. I went back to my campsite to figure out some other way to get out. I could make friends with the young fellow or the girl, they might help me. If I only could talk to them. Then I thought of a fellow who saved himself from a mad bull by blinding him with snuff in his eyes. But how will I get near enough to this fellow to put snuff in his eyes? So I decided next time I give the young fellow my snuff box to leave a few grains of snuff in it. He might give the old man a taste of it. But the question is, in what direction will I go, if I should get out? I must have been near 25 miles northeast of Toba Inlet when I was kidnapped. This fellow must have traveled at least 25 miles in the 3 hours he carried me. If he went west we would be near salt water, same thing if he went south, therefore he must have gone northeast. If I then keep going south and over 2 mountains, I must hit salt water someplace between Lund and Vancouver. The following day I did not see the old lady till about 4 p.m. She came home with her arms full of grass and twigs and of all kinds of spruce and hemlock as well as some kind of nuts that grow in the ground. I have seen lots of them on Vancouver Island. The young fellow went up the mountain to the east every day, he could climb better than a mountain goat. He picked some kind of grass with long sweet roots. He gave me some one day, they tasted very sweet. I gave him another snuff box with about a teaspoon of snuff in it. He tasted it, then went to the old man, he licked it with his tongue. They had a long chat. I made a dipper from a milk can. I made many dippers, you can use them for pots too. You cut 2 slits near the top of any can, then cut a limb from any small tree, cut down back of the limb down the stem of the tree, then taper the part you cut from the stem. Then cut a hole in the tapered part, slide the tapered part in the slit you have made in the can, and you have a good handle on your can. I threw one over to the young fellow, that was playing near my camp, he picked it up and looked at it, then he went to the old man and showed it to him. They had a long chatter. Then he came to me, pointed at the dipper then at his sister. I could see that he wanted one for her too. I had other peas and carrots, so I made one for his sister. He was standing only 8 feet away from me. When I had made the dipper, I dipped it in water and drank from it, he was very pleased, almost smiled at me. Then I took a chew of snuff, smacked my lips, said that's good. The young fellow pointed to the old man, said something that sounded like, okay. I got the idea that the old man liked snuff, and the young fellow wanted a box for the old man. I shook my head. I motioned with my hands for the old man to come to me. I do not think the young fellow understood what I meant. He went to his sister and gave her the dipper I made for her. They did not come near me again that day. I had now been here 6 days, but I was sure I was making progress. If only I could get the old man to come over to me, get him to eat a full box of snuff that would kill him for sure, and that way kill himself, I wouldn't be guilty of murder. The old lady was a meek old thing. The young fellow was by this time quite friendly. The girl would not hurt anybody. Her chest was flat like a boy's, no development like young ladies. I am sure if I could get the old man out of the way I could easily have brought this girl out with me to civilization. But what good would that have been? I would have to keep her in a cage for public display. I don't think we have any right to force our way of life on other people, and I don't think they would like it. The noise and racket in a modern city they would not like any more than I do. The young fellow might have been between 11 to 18 years old and about 7 feet tall and might weigh about 300 pounds. His chest would be 50 to 55 inches, his waist about 36 to 38 inches. He had wide jaws, narrow forehead, that slanted upward round at the back about 4 or 5 inches higher than the forehead. The hair on their heads was about 6 inches long. The hair on the rest of their body was short and thick in places. The women's hair on the forehead had an upward turn like some women have, they call it bangs, among women's hairdos. Nowadays the old lady could have been anything between 40 to 70 years old. She was over 7 feet tall. She would be about 500 to 600 pounds. She had very wide hips, and a goose-like walk. She was not built for beauty or speed. Some of those lovable brasiers and uplifts would have been a great improvement on her looks and her figure. The man's eye teeth were longer than the rest of the teeth, but not long enough to be called tusks. The old man must have been near 8 feet tall. Big barrel chest and big hump on his back, powerful shoulders, his biceps on upper arm were enormous and tapered down to his elbows. His forearms were longer than common people have, but well proportioned. His hands were wide, the palm was long and broad, and hollow like a scoop. His fingers were short in proportion to the rest of his hand. His fingernails were like chisels. The only place they had no hair was inside their hands and the soles of their feet and upper part of the nose and eyelids. I never did see their ears, they were covered with hair hanging over them. If the old man were to wear a collar it would have to be at least 30 inches. I have no idea what size shoes they would need. I was watching the young fellow's foot one day when he was sitting down. The soles of his feet seemed to be padded like a dog's foot, and the big toe was longer than the rest and very strong. In mountain climbing all he needed was footing for his big toe. They were very agile. To sit down they turned their knees out and came straight down. To rise they came straight up without help of hands or arms. I don't think this valley was their permanent home. I think they moved from place to place, as food is available in different localities. They might eat meat, but I never saw them eat meat, or do any cooking. I think this was probably a stopover place and the plants with sweet roots on the mountainside might have been in season this time of the year. They seem to be most interested in them. The roots have a very sweet and satisfying taste. They always seem to do everything for a reason, wasted no time on anything they did not need. When they were not looking for food, the old man and the old lady were resting, but the boy and the girl were always climbing something or some other exercise. A favorite position was to take hold of his feet with his hands and balance on his rump, then bounce forward. The idea seems to be to see how far he could go without his feet or hands touching the ground. Sometimes he made 20 feet. But what do they want with me? They must understand I cannot stay here indefinitely. I will soon have to make a break for freedom. Not that I was mistreated in any way. One consolation was that the old man was coming closer each day, and was very interested in my snuff. Watching me when I take a pinch of snuff. He seems to think it useless to only put it inside my lips. One morning after I had my breakfast, both the old man and the boy came and sat down only 10 feet away from me. This morning I made coffee. I had saved up all dry branches I found, and I had some dry moss, and I used all the labels from cans to start a fire. I got my coffee pot boiling, and it was strong coffee too, and the aroma from boiling coffee was what brought them over. I was sitting eating hardtack with plenty of butter on, and sipping coffee. And it sure tasted good. I was smacking my lips pretending it was better than it really was. I set the can down that was about half full. I intended to warm it up later. I pulled out a full box of snuff, took a big chew. Before I had time to close the box, the old man reached for it. I was afraid he would waste it, and only had 2 more boxes. So I held on to the box, intending him to take a pinch like I had just done. Instead, he grabbed the box and emptied it in his mouth. Swallowed it in one gulp. Then he licked the box inside with his tongue. After a few minutes his eyes began to roll over in his head. He was looking straight up. I could see he was sick. Then he grabbed my coffee can that was quite cold by this time. He emptied that in his mouth, grounds and all. That did no good. He stuck his head between his legs and rolled forwards a few times away from me. Then he began to squeal like a stuck pig. I grabbed my rifle. I said to myself, this is it. If he comes for me, I will shoot him plumb between his eyes. But he started for the spring. He wanted water. I packed my sleeping bag in my pack sack with the few cans I had left. The young fellow ran over to his mother. Then she began to squeal. I started for the opening in the wall, and I just made it. The old lady was right behind me. I fired one shot at the rock over her head. I guess she had never seen a rifle fired before. She turned and ran inside the wall. I injected another shell in the barrel of my rifle and started downhill, looking back over my shoulder every so often to see if they were coming. I was in a canyon, and good traveling, and I made fast time. Must have made 3 miles in some world record time. I came to a turn in the canyon and I had the sun on my left. That meant I was going south, and the canyon turned west. I decided to climb the ridge ahead of me. I knew that I must have 2 mountain ridges between me and salt water, and by climbing this ridge I would have a good view of this canyon, so I could see if the Sasquatch were coming after me. I had a light pack and was making good time up this hill. I stopped soon after to look back to where I came from, but nobody followed me. As I came over the ridge I could see empty Baker. Then I knew I was going in the right direction. I was hungry and tired. I opened my packsack to see what I had to eat. I decided to rest here for a while. I had a good view of the mountainside, and if the old man was coming I had the advantage because I was up above him. To get me he would have to come up a steep hill. And that might not be so easy after stopping a few 30 to 30 bullets. I had made up my mind this was my last chance, and this would be a fight to the finish. I rested here for 2 hours. It was 3 p.m. when I started down the mountainside. It was nice going, not too steep and not too much underbrush. When I got near the bottom, I shot a big blue grouse. She was sitting on a windfall, looking right at me, only 100 feet away. I shot her neck right off. I made it down the creek at the bottom of this canyon. I felt I was safe now. I made a fire between 2 big boulders, roasted the grouse. Next morning when I woke up, I was feeling terrible. My feet were sore from dirty socks. My legs were sore, my stomach was upset from that grouse that I ate the night before. I was not too sure I was going to make it up that mountain. I finally made the top, but it took me 6 hours to get there. It was cloudy, visibility about a mile. I knew I had to go downhill. After about 2 hours I got down to the heavy timber and sat down to rest. I could hear a motor running hard at times, then stop. I listened to this for a while and decided the sound was from a gas donkey. Someone was logging in the neighborhood. I told them I was a prospector and was lost. I did not like to tell them I had been kidnapped by a Sasquatch, as if I had told them, they would probably have said, he is crazy too. The following day I went down from this camp on Salmon Arm branch of Seashelt Inlet. From there I got the Union boat back to Vancouver. That was my last prospecting trip, and my only experience with what is known as Sasquatches. I know that in 1924 there were 4 Sasquatches living, it might be only 2 now. The old man and the old lady might be dead by this time.
The Diary of Elkanah Walker. If we are to believe the Diary of Elkanah Walker, pioneer American missionary in Washington State, to the spoken Indians, he wrote, "Bear with me if I trouble you with a little of their superstitions. They believe in a race of giants, which inhabit a certain mountain off to the west of us. This mountain is covered with perpetual snow. They, the creatures, inhabit the snow peaks. They hunt and do all their work at night. They are men stealers. They come to people's lodges at night when the people are asleep and take them and put them under their skins and to their place of abode without even waking. Their track is 1.5 feet long. They steal salmon from Indian nets and eat them raw as the bears do. If the people are awake, they always know when they are coming very near by their strong smell that is most intolerable. It is not uncommon for them to come in the night and give 3 whistles, and then the stones will begin to hit their houses." Drury, 1976, pages 122 to 123. Reverend Walker's established mission was approximately located 25 miles northwest of present-day Spokane, Washington. His diary entry of the snow peak to the west could be one of several peaks in the Cascade Range, such as Mt. Baker, Montana Rainier, Mt. Adams, or Mount St. Helens, or possibly he could have meant Mt. Hood on the Oregon side of Columbia River. But Sasquatch researchers, myself among them, generally believe the missionary was referring to Mt. St. Helens, which has always carried legends of Sasquatches, ape-like men, and of course the 1924 story of Fred Beck in Ape Canyon. Missionary Walker also penned pre-Civil War references to this beautiful Mt. St. Helens as a place where the white man and the Indians never frequented, and who assert it is inhabited by a race of beings of a different species, who are cannibals and whom they hold in great dread. In his private writings, he declared the Indians called these different beings Seacos or Celtics, words which he thought at the time of his writings possibly refer to renegade or outcast Indians banished from tribal villages, and not the elusive timber giant. Of this referential point we can't be sure, but his diaries were the first to make mention of it.
William Rowe's sworn affidavit. I, W. Rowe of the city of Edmonton, in the province of Alberta, make oath and say: 1. That the Exhibit A attached to this, my affidavit, is absolutely true and correct in all details. Sworn before me in the city of Edmonton, province of Alberta, this 26th day of August, AD 1957. Signed, William Rowe. Signed, by W. H. Clark, Assistant Claims Agent. Number DD 2822. Exhibit A. Ever since I was a small boy back in the forest of Michigan, I have studied the lives and habits of wild animals. Later, when I supported my family in northern Alberta by hunting and trapping, I spent many hours just observing the wild things. They fascinated me. But the most incredible experience I ever had with a wild creature occurred near a little town called Tet John Cache, British Columbia, about 80 miles west of Jasper, Alberta. I had been working on the highway near Tet John Cache for about 2 years. In October, 1955, I decided to climb 5 miles up Mica Mountain to an old deserted mine, just for something to do. I came in sight of the mine about 3 o'clock in the afternoon after an easy climb. I had just come out of a patch of low brush into a clearing when I saw what I thought was a grizzly bear, in the bush on the other side. I had shot a grizzly near that spot the year before. This one was only about 75 yards away, but I didn't want to shoot it, for I had no way of getting it out. So I sat down on a small rock and watched, my rifle in my hands. I could see part of the animal's head and the top of one shoulder. A moment later it raised up and stepped out into the opening. Then I saw it was not a bear. This, to the best of my recollection, is what the creature looked like and how it acted as it came across the clearing directly toward me. My first impression was of a huge man, about 6 feet tall, almost 3 feet wide, and probably weighing somewhere near 300 pounds. It was covered from head to foot with dark brown silver-tipped hair. But as it came closer I saw by its breasts that it was female. And yet, its torso was not curved like a female's. Its broad frame was straight from shoulder to hip. Its arms were much thicker than a man's arms, and longer, reaching almost to its knees. Its feet were broader proportionately than a man's, about 5 inches wide at the front and tapering to much thinner heels. When it walked it placed the heel of its foot down first, and I could see the gray-brown skin or hide on the soles of its feet. It came to the edge of the bush I was hiding in, within 20 feet of me, and squatted down on its haunches. Reaching out its hands it pulled the branches of bushes toward it and stripped the leaves with its teeth. Its lips curled flexibly around the leaves as it ate. I was close enough to see that its teeth were white and even. The shape of this creature's head somewhat resembled a Negro's. The head was higher at the back than at the front. The nose was broad and flat. The lips and chin protruded farther than its nose. But the hair that covered it, leaving bare only the parts of its face around the mouth, nose, and ears, made it resemble an animal as much as a human. None of this hair, even on the back of its head, was longer than an inch, and that on its face was much shorter. Its ears were shaped like a human's ears. But its eyes were small and black like a bear's. And its neck also was unhuman. Thicker and shorter than any man's I had ever seen. As I watched this creature, I wondered if some movie company was making a film at this place and that what I saw was an actor, made up to look partly human and partly animal. But as I observed it more, I decided it would be impossible to fake such a specimen. Anyway, I learned later there was no such company near that area. Nor, in fact, did anyone live up Mica Mountain, according to the people who lived in Tet John Cache. Finally the wild thing must have got my scent, for it looked directly at me through an opening in the brush. A look of amazement crossed its face. It looked so comical at the moment I had to grin. Still in a crouched position, it backed up 3 or 4 short steps, then straightened up to its full height and started to walk rapidly back the way it had come. For a moment it watched me over its shoulder as it went, not exactly afraid, but as though it wanted no contact with anything strange. The thought came to me that if I shot it, I would possibly have a specimen of great interest to scientists the world over. I had heard stories of the Sasquatch, the giant hairy Indians that live in the legends of British Columbia Indians, and also many claim, are still in fact alive today. Maybe this was a Sasquatch, I told myself. I leveled my rifle. The creature was still walking rapidly away, again turning its head to look in my direction. I lowered the rifle. Although I have called the creature it, I felt now that it was a human being and I knew I would never forgive myself if I killed it. Just as it came to the other patch of brush it threw its head back and made a peculiar noise that seemed to be half laugh and half language, and which I can only describe as a kind of a whinny. Then it walked from the small brush into a stand of lodgepole pine. I stepped out into the opening and looked across a small ridge just beyond the pine to see if I could see it again. It came out on the ridge a couple of 100 yards away from me, tipped its head back again, and again emitted the only sound I had heard it make, but what this half-laugh, half-language was meant to convey, I do not know. It disappeared then, and I never saw it again. I wanted to find out if it lived on vegetation entirely or ate meat as well, so I went down and looked for signs. I found it in 5 different places, and although I examined it thoroughly, could find no hair or shells of bugs or insects. So I believe it was strictly a vegetarian. I found one place where it had slept for a couple of nights under a tree. Now, the nights were cool up the mountain, at this time of year especially, and yet it had not used a fire. I found no sign that it possessed even the simplest of tools. Nor a single companion while in this place. Whether this was a Sasquatch I do not know. It will always remain a mystery to me, unless another one is found. I hereby declare the above statement to be in every part true, to the best of my powers of observation and recollection. Signed, William Rowe.
The Story of Muchalat Harry, by Peter Byrne. According to the Indians, there was once a large number of Bigfoot living on Vancouver Island, a large island, 12,408 square miles in area, off the west coast of British Columbia. The Indians knew about them, feared them, and respected them, but granted that they were harmless. One of the Indians of the Nuka tribe, who lived at Nuka in 1928, claims to have been carried off by them and held captive for some time. The story, told to me by Father Anthony Terhar of Mt. Angel Abbey in Oregon, is a curious one. Father Anthony, a much-loved missionary priest who traveled the west coast of Vancouver Island for many years, was living at Nuka at the time of the story, and he knew Muchalat Harry very well. Muchalat Harry was a trapper and something of a rarity among his fellow tribesmen. He was, according to Father Anthony, a tough, fearless man of excellent physique. In the course of his trapping, he was one to spend long weeks in the forest alone, something that the average Indian did not do in those days. The Indians of the coast were apparently a rather timid people, and they seemed to regard the deep forest as a home and territory of the Bigfoot. When they went into the deep inland forest for any reason, they never went alone. Muchalat Harry was different from other Indians. He went in the forest alone and feared nothing. Late one autumn, Muchalat Harry set off for the woods with his traps and camping gear. His plan was to set out a trap line and stay in the woods for several months. He headed for his favorite hunting area, the Conuma River at the head of Tulipana Inlet. From Nuka, he paddled his own canoe to the mouth of the Conuma. There he cached the canoe and headed upstream on foot. Approximately 12 miles upstream, he made his base camp and, after building himself a lean-to, started to put out his trap line. One night, while wrapped in his blankets and clad only in his underwear, he was suddenly picked up by a huge male Bigfoot and carried off into the hills. He was not carried very far, probably a distance of about 2 or 3 miles, at the most. When daylight came, he was able to see that he was in a sort of camp under a high rock shelf and surrounded by some 20 Bigfoot. They were of all sexes and sizes. For some time, they stood around him and stared at him, the males to the front of the curious group, females behind them, and young ones to the rear. Muchalat Harry was frightened at first, and his fear grew to terror when he noticed, he said, the large number of bones lying around the campsite. When he saw these, he was convinced that the big feet were going to eat him. The big feet did not harm him in any way. Occasionally, one came forward and touched him, as if feeling him, and when they discovered that his skin was loose, it was in fact his woolen underwear, several came forward and pulled at it gently. The Story of Muchalat Harry, by Peter Byrne. According to the Indians, there was once a large number of Bigfoot living on Vancouver Island, a large island, 12,408 square miles in area, off the west coast of British Columbia. The Indians knew about them, feared them, and respected them, but granted that they were harmless. One of the Indians of the Nuka tribe, who lived at Nuka in 1928, claims to have been carried off by them and held captive for some time. The story, told to me by Father Anthony Terhar of Mt. Angel Abbey in Oregon, is a curious one. Father Anthony, a much-loved missionary priest who traveled the west coast of Vancouver Island for many years, was living at Nuka at the time of the story, and he knew Muchalat Harry very well. Muchalat Harry was a trapper and something of a rarity among his fellow tribesmen. He was, according to Father Anthony, a tough, fearless man of excellent physique. In the course of his trapping, he was one to spend long weeks in the forest alone, something that the average Indian did not do in those days. The Indians of the coast were apparently a rather timid people, and they seemed to regard the deep forest as a home and territory of the Bigfoot. When they went into the deep inland forest for any reason, they never went alone. Muchalat Harry was different from other Indians. He went in the forest alone and feared nothing. Late one autumn, Muchalat Harry set off for the woods with his traps and camping gear. His plan was to set out a trap line and stay in the woods for several months. He headed for his favorite hunting area, the Conuma River at the head of Tulipana Inlet. From Nuka, he paddled his own canoe to the mouth of the Conuma. There he cached the canoe and headed upstream on foot. Approximately 12 miles upstream, he made his base camp and, after building himself a lean-to, started to put out his trap line. One night, while wrapped in his blankets and clad only in his underwear, he was suddenly picked up by a huge male Bigfoot and carried off into the hills. He was not carried very far, probably a distance of about 2 or 3 miles, at the most. When daylight came, he was able to see that he was in a sort of camp under a high rock shelf and surrounded by some 20 Bigfoot. They were of all sexes and sizes. For some time, they stood around him and stared at him, the males to the front of the curious group, females behind them, and young ones to the rear. Muchalat Harry was frightened at first, and his fear grew to terror when he noticed, he said, the large number of bones lying around the campsite. When he saw these, he was convinced that the big feet were going to eat him. The big feet did not harm him in any way. Occasionally, one came forward and touched him, as if feeling him, and when they discovered that his skin was loose, it was in fact his woolen underwear, several came forward and pulled at it gently. The country was generally wild and deserted, and the actual mouth of the Kanuma, where it flowed into the salt waters of the inlet, was one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. Some of the forests close to the river had been logged off, but the logging work had moved on west, and while I was there it was quiet. The days began with morning mist on the river, and then warmed to the clear crispness of perfect autumn weather. Evenings were cool and damp, and nights bright with starlight that provided almost enough light to read. I found no sign of Bigfoot on the Kanuma, nor any sign of Muchalat Harry's trapline or lean-to. I hardly expected to find anything of the latter after 40-odd years. But even though Muchalat Harry was long gone, the river and the forest remained unchanged. The splashing salmon, the cold, clear water of the Kanuma, the moss-covered banks, the shallow pools and forests that the Kanuma drained, that were the breeding places of the salmon, the river birds, the plodding bears, the deep silent waters of the inlet, all were as they must have been 40 years before when Muchalat Harry cached his canoe and made his camp there.
The Bauman story. Presidential frontiersman, Rough Rider, Teddy Roosevelt began writing his soon-to-be-published book in 1890. Titled The Wilderness Hunter, the author writes of a grizzled, weather-beaten trapper by the name of Bauman, whose figure of a man reminded me of actor Robert Redford's portrayal of the legendary woodsman tracker Jeremiah Johnson. Bauman, however, was German-born, lived all of his life out on the early frontier. Roosevelt must have had some degree of belief in Bauman's tale to include his thoughts in his book. Before his legendary encounter, Roger Patterson wrote in his 1966 book, Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist, that he, Roosevelt, was a hard man to fool with a wild tale. Bauman must have held to the story, for it was said that he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points in the yarn. A yarn that was to become a legend at Roosevelt's unwitting recounting, weathering the retelling for more than 100 years and will go on ad infinitum. One of Idaho's best-known horror stories, it tells the story of two trappers who set out on a beaver hunt in the still remote alpine terrain of the beautiful Salmon River countryside. This portion of the Salmon River is located in the Bitterroot Mountains between the state of Idaho and Montana. To this day, stories of the Sasquatch come out of this part of this virgin wilderness. Roosevelt wrote that the previous year a trapper's body had been found torn to bits and partially eaten by an unknown beast, which left enormous human foot tracks in its wake. Bears do not leave human footprints, overlapping bear tracks upon one another can be differentiated. Oblivious to what should have been a warning to the senses, these two men journeyed deep into the wilderness remote regions, moving campsites from one creek to another in search of satisfactory places in which to place their beaver traps. Here is that famous excerpt about Bauman from Roosevelt's book. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be very superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical, and have too little imagination in things spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of a perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story, which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter, named Bauman, who, born and had passed all of his life on the frontier, told it the story to me. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tale, but he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore. So that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps, of the snowwalkers, and the specters, spirits, ghosts and apparitions, the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths, and dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. It may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird and elfin traits to what was merely some abnormally wicked and cunning wild beast, but whether this was so or not, no man can say. When the event occurred, Bauman was still a young man, and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the salmon from the head of Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass through which ran a small stream said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighted very lightly with the two trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their two lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass where they left them in an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being from there onward impracticable for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast, gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were plenty. There was still an hour or two of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk they again reached camp. The glade in which it was pitched was not many yards wide, the tall, close-set pines and firs rising round it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, beyond which rose the steep mountain slope, covered with the unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence something, apparently a bear, had visited camp, and had rummaged about among their things, scattering the contents of their packs, and in sheer wantonness destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds and stores and lighting the fire. While Bauman was making ready supper, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a brand from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or two, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs." Bauman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon again examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the 2 men rolled up in their blankets, and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight Bauman was awakened by some noise, and sat up in his blankets. As he did so his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Grasping his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and the night. After this the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening and put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement they kept together all day, and returned to camp towards evening. On nearing it they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding, and destroyed the shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and, after a careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever the thing was, it had walked off on but 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight the thing came down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a peculiarly sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning the two trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were the more ready to do this because in spite of seeing a good deal of game sign they had caught very little fur. However, it was necessary first to go along the line of their traps and gather them, and this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets they occasionally heard a branch snap after they had passed, and now and then there were slight rustling noises among the small pines to one side of them. At noon they were back within a couple of miles of camp. In the high, bright sunlight their fears seemed absurd to the two armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger from man, brute or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bauman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp, under the tall trees, the silence and desolation of the forest waited on him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sunrays, striking through among the straight trunks, made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness which, when there is no breeze, always broods over these somber primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay and shouted as he approached it, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bauman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward he again shouted, and as he did so his eye fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks in the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire, and his back to the dense woods, to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man, and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its 4 paws, while it buried its teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gambled around it in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Bauman, utterly unnerved and believing that the creature with which he had to deal was something either half-human or half-devil, some great goblin beast, abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. Mounting, he rode onwards through the night, until beyond reach of pursuit. There is, by the way, a second passage in The Wilderness Hunter where Teddy Roosevelt may quite possibly have been describing a personal Bigfoot experience. He writes about how he and a friend were on a hunting trip in the state of Washington. They had contracted a Native American to guide them into a remote region. Their guide urged them to avoid a particular area due to some native superstition that hunter-tracker Roosevelt held as utterly preposterous. In any event, old Rough Rider Roosevelt, as was his way sometimes, bullied the apprehensive guide into taking them to this area anyway. They did not find any big game during that trek or other sign, but Roosevelt made a point of mentioning the very strange noises he heard at night while camping there. He did not recognize nor describe the noises, but he did give the distinct impression that they were unusual in his learned experience and found them to be unsettling. Uncharacteristically, Roosevelt did not offer any explanation or speculation about the source of the noises, simply mentioned them, and said no more about it. Odd for an author who otherwise went into such vivid detail relative to the animals he observed and hunted. While the killer creature was never given a clearly defined name, Bigfoot buffs believe firmly that this creature was a Sasquatch, but I could use some measure of convincing. Taken on its own, the Bauman story is not very impressive as evidence for the existence of wild men in North America, but when considered along with the more substantive reports it acquires greater significance. Ultimately, readers of these eyewitness accounts will be left to judge for themselves the significance and value ostensibly placed on these stories in the future.
Ruby Creek. Stories about the Sasquatch have been appearing in print from time to time since the 1860s, and I have clipping in my files from almost every year since the early 1920s. But the modern history of the Sasquatch really dates from September 1941, when one of these creatures paid a visit, in broad daylight, to an Indian family named Chapman. While the Amerindian stories have usually been dismissed as legend or laughed off because Indians are not supposed to be reliable, this experience was accompanied by too much physical evidence to be ignored. The Chapman family consisted of George and Jeannie Chapman, and children numbering, at my visit, 4. Mr. Chapman worked on a railroad, and was living at that time in a small place called Ruby Creek, 30 miles up the Fraser River from Agassiz, British Columbia, in Canada's Great Western Province. It was about 3 in the afternoon of a sunny, cloudless day when Jeannie Chapman's eldest son, then age 9, came running to the house, saying that there was a cow coming down out of the woods at the foot of the nearby mountain. The other kids, a boy age 7 and a little girl 5, were still playing in a field behind the house bordering on the rail track. Mrs. Chapman went out to look, since the boys seemed oddly disturbed, and they saw what at first she thought was a very big bear moving about among the bushes bordering the field beyond the railway tracks. She called the 2 children who came running immediately. Then the creature moved onto the tracks, and she saw to her horror that it was a gigantic man covered with hair, not fur. The hair seemed to be about 4 inches long all over, and of a pale yellow-brown color. To pin down this color, Mrs. Chapman pointed out to me a sheet of lightly varnished plywood in the room where we were sitting. This was of a brown ochre color. This creature advanced directly toward the house, and Mrs. Chapman had, as she put it, much too much time to look at it, because she stood her ground outside while the eldest boy, on her instructions, got a blanket from the house and rounded up the other children. The kids were in a near panic, she told us, and it took 2 or 3 minutes to get the blanket, during which time the creature had reached the near corner of the field only about 100 feet away from her. Mrs. Chapman then spread the blanket and, holding it aloft so that the kids could not see the creature or at them, she backed off at the double to the old field and down onto the river beach out of sight, and then ran with the kids downstream to the village. I asked her a leading question about the blanket. Had her purpose in using it been to prevent her kids seeing the creature, in accord with an alleged Amerindian belief that to do so brings bad luck and often death? Her reply was both prompt and surprising. She said that, although she had heard white men tell that belief, she had not heard it from her parents or any other of her people whose advice regarding the so-called Sasquatch had been simply not to go further than certain points of certain valleys, to run as she saw one, and not to struggle if one caught her, as it might squeeze her to death by mistake. No, she said, I used the blanket because I thought it was after one of the kids, and so might go into the house to look for them instead of following me. This seems to have been sound logic, as the creature did go into the house and also rummage through an old outhouse pretty thoroughly, hauling from a 55-gallon barrel of saltfish, breaking this open, and scattering its contents about outside. The irony of it is that all those 3 children did die within 3 years, the 2 boys by drowning and the little girl on a sickbed. And just after I interviewed the Chapmans, they also were drowned in the Fraser River when a rowboat capsized. Mrs. Chapman told me that the creature was about 7.5 feet tall. She could estimate its height by the various fence and line posts standing about the field. It had a rather small head and a very short, thick neck. In fact, really no neck at all, a point that was emphasized by William Rowe and by all others who claimed to have seen one of these creatures. Its body was entirely human in shape, except that it was immensely thick through its chest, and its arms were exceptionally long. She did not see the feet, which were in the grass. Its shoulders were very wide, and it had no breasts, from which Mrs. Chapman assumed it was a male, though she also did not see any male genitalia due to the long hair covering its groin. She was most definite on one point. The naked parts of its face and its hands were much darker than its hair, and appeared to be almost black. George Chapman returned home from his work on the railroad that day shortly before 6 in the evening, and by a route that bypassed the village, so that he saw no one to tell him what had happened. When he reached his house, he immediately saw the woodshed door battered in and spotted enormous humanoid footprints all over the place. Greatly alarmed, for he, like all his people, had heard since childhood about the big wild men of the mountains, though he did not hear the word Sasquatch till after this incident. He called for his family and then dashed through the house. Then he spotted the foot tracks of his wife and kids going off toward the river. He followed these until he picked them up on the sand beside the river and saw them going off downstream, without any giant ones following. Somewhat relieved, he was retracing his steps when he stumbled across the giant's foot tracks on the river bank farther upstream. These had come down out of the potato patch, which lay between the house and the river, had milled about by the river, and then gone back to the old field toward the foot of the mountains where they disappeared in the heavy growth. Returning to the house, relieved to know that the tracks of all four of his family had gone off downstream to the village, George Chapman went to examine the woodshed. In our interview, after 18 years, he still expressed voluble astonishment that any living thing, even a 7'6" man with a barrel chest, could lift a 55-gallon tub of fish and break it open without using a tool. He confirmed the creature's height after finding a number of long brown hairs stuck in the slabwood lintel of the doorway, above the level of his head. George Chapman then went off to the village to look for his family, and found them in a state of calm collapse. He gathered them up and invited his father-in-law and 2 others to return with him for protection of his family when he was away at work. The foot tracks returned every night for a week, and on 2 occasions the dogs that the Chapmans had taken with them set up the most awful racket at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The Sasquatch did not, however, molest them or, apparently, touch either the house or the woodshed, but the whole business was too unnerving, and the family finally moved out. They never went back. After a long chat about this and other matters, Mrs. Chapman suddenly told us something very significant just as we were leaving. She said, "It made an awful funny noise." I asked her if she could imitate this noise for me, but it was her husband who did so, saying that he had heard it at night twice during the week after the first incident. He then proceeded to utter exactly the same strange, gurgling whistle that the men in California, who said they had heard a Bigfoot call, had given us. This is a sound I cannot reproduce in print, but I can assure you that it is unlike anything I have ever heard given by man or beast anywhere in the world. To me, this information is of the greatest significance that an Amerindian couple in British Columbia should give out with exactly the same strange sounding connection with Sasquatch that 2 highly educated white men did, over 600 miles south in connection with California's Bigfoot, is incredible. If this is all hoax or a publicity stunt or mass hallucination, as some people have claimed, how does it happen that this noise, which defies description, always sounds the same no matter who has tried to reproduce it for me? These were probably the last words on the Sasquatch that the Chapmans uttered, and I absolutely refuse to listen to anybody who might say they were lying. Admittedly, honest men are such a rarity as possibly to be non-existent, but I have met a few who could qualify, and I put the Chapmans near the head of the list. I fought the 8 men of Mount St. Helens. Wah. Told by Fred Beck of Kelso, Washington. Written September 27, 1967 by his son. Copyright Ronald A. Beck, 1967. What are abominable snowmen? Fred Beck is qualified to tell what they are. He was one of a party of 5 miners attacked by them in 1924, the most famous of such incidents in North America. The incident has become a legend in the Northwest. He tells the real facts after 43 years of silence. Introduction. It is my intention in this book not only to tell you about the historic encounter I had with these mysterious creatures, but also to reveal to the public what I believe they are. Truth often is stranger than fiction, but the strangeness comes from the clouds surrounding our minds, not from the mystery itself. This is not a large book, but may the largeness be conveyed by the picture I hope to paint of truth. Much has been written about that day in 1924, and I feel it right that I express my views at last. To avoid embarrassment to the relatives of the other 4 men involved in the 1924 incident, I have not directly mentioned their names. The name, Hank, is a pseudonym of one of the main characters in the incident. Chapter 1, The Attack. First of all, I wish to give an account of the attack and tell the famous incident of July 1924 when the hairy apes attacked our cabin. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the MT St. Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had, from time to time, come across large tracks by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claim, the Vander White. It was 2 miles east of MT St. Helens near a deep canyon now named Ape Canyon, which was so named after an account the incident reached the newspapers. Hank, a great hunter and good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks. The tracks were large, and we knew that no known animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches long. It was in the middle of July, and we had received good assay on our claim, and everyone was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he should take me to town to see a dentist, but he was so enthused in the prospect of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. We had all come up in his Ford, and I had no way to get to town unless he took me. So when we went back to our cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hot cakes. Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge, and then hear an answering whistling from another ridge. We also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound, just like something was hitting itself on its chest. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring, about 100 yards from our cabin, to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles, to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant, I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away, on the other side of the little canyon. Standing by a pine tree, it dodged behind the tree, and poked its head out from the side of the tree, and at the same time, Hank shot. I could see the bark fly out from the tree, from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that that was quite a distance to see the bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall, with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it running fast and upright, about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party, and we all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves and had made it very sturdy. It stood for years afterward and was visited by many sightseers until a few years ago when it was burned to the ground. The circumstances of the fire, I do not recall. In the cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which 2 could sleep, feet to feet, the rest of us sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin, we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin, so darkness found all of us in the cabin, more calm now. And my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around, puffing on pipes, and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcome bed and soon fell asleep. About midnight, we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking, but the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from between the logs, and it fell across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand and was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, my gun being a .30 to .30 Winchester, which I still have. I helped to get the chinking off him, and he jumped to his feet. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual count, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. This was the start of the famous attack, of which so much has been written in Washington and Oregon papers throughout the years. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin, and say some even fell through the roof, but this was not quite the case. There were very few large rocks around in that area. It is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof, but hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace. Some accounts state I was hit in the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is not true. The only time we shot our guns at night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking had we chosen to shoot. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the huge log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, but this was pretty much an impossibility. As previously stated, the cabin was a sturdy made building. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. One had a pistol, which still is in my family's possession. The others clutched their rifles. They seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm to the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle, a much written about incident and a true one. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright, so that it caught on the logs, and at the same time Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go, and I pulled the handle back in and put the axe in a safe place. A humorous thing I well remember was Hank singing, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning." He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious and sang under the impression that the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures, standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times, and it toppled over the cliff, down into the gorge, some 400 feet below. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible, and not bother to pack our supplies or equipment out. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than our lives. We were all only too glad to agree. We brought out only that which we could get in our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the happenings to anyone, and they agreed, but Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went in to the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." That was just what Hank did, to the puzzlement of the ranger. When we were back home in Kelso, Washington, he told some of his friends, and somehow the story leaked out to the papers, and the Great Hairy Ape Hunt of 1924 was on. Local reporters interviewed us. They came from Portland and Seattle. Even a big game hunter from England came asking questions, and he had a large gun with him that must have been an elephant gun. Many people flocked to the MT St. Helens area looking for the great hairy apes or mountain devils. I, myself, went back with 2 reporters and a detective from Portland, Oregon. We found large tracks, and they photographed them. We did not see any of the ape men then, nor could we find the ones we had shot. So people were asking questions. Was it true, or was it just a wild tale? I can assure you it is true. Are they human, animal, or devils? I will answer that question in this book. That was a great ape hunt in 1924. In the last few years, more and more people have reported seeing them. There is an ape hunt being revived again, and another man has written a book on the subject and has formed a club whose purpose is to find evidence to prove what they already believe, that abominable snowmen of America do exist. A wealthy person has offered a large sum of money for anyone that can capture one alive. Sightings have been reported in Canada, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. But the purpose of this book is not only to relate my experiences, but also to bring to light my knowledge about the abominable snowmen. I do not wish to embark upon an expedition, but I wish to tell what these beings are.
Chapter 2. Longview Daily News, Saturday through Sunday, June 27 to 28, 1964. Legendary and St. Helens Apemen called legitimate. The legend of the ape men of St. Helens returns, like hay fever, with summer weather. The story of the ape men of the beautiful conical mountain situated in the Cascade Range of southwest Washington is a favorite in the area, but it just may have some basis in fact. There is more basis to support it than Nepal's Yeti or Northern California's Bigfoot, and probably as much as Loch Ness Monster. Last summer, 2 different Portland groups who visited the region reported sighting the monsters, usually described as from 7 to 10 feet tall, hairy and either white or beige colored. 3 persons in a car on a lonely forest road said they saw one of the creatures when it flashed across the headlight beams of their car near the wilderness area, which includes such places as Ape Canyon. A Portland couple fishing on the Lewis River south of the mountain saw a huge beige figure, bigger than any human, amble off into the brush. Old-timers aren't surprised, just amused. The ape man legend actually is older than the white man's habitation of the Pacific Northwest. Indian legend. Forestry employees have investigated many reports of the strange creatures. According to Indian legend, the apes were the ferocious Celtic Indians, a band of renegades much like giant apes in appearance who lived like wild animals in the secluded caves of the Cascades. The first recorded encounter of the apes with white men was in 1924. A group of 5 prospectors rushed into Kelso to report that a group of great, ape-like creatures had attacked them in the middle of the night. The miners said they had been working a mine on the east slopes of St. Helens. During the daytime, they saw some of the apes and fired at them to halt an apparent attack. One of the apes appeared to have been hit and rolled into a deep ravine. That night, according to the account, the ape men hurled rocks onto the cabin and danced and screamed until daylight. Then came the Great Ape Hunt 0F 1924. Law enforcement officers and a flock of newspapermen made up a posse that went into the area. The armed searchers fired at anything that moved, so the report went. They returned to tell of finding huge footprints, but no apes. The legend grew from that point for several years, then subsided with only sporadic reports of traces of the apes. Responsible persons, experienced mountaineers and skiers, have given credence to the story. Bob Lee of Portland, a leader of the 1961 Himalayan expedition and advisor to last year's Himalayan expedition, said last year he had a strange experience. Lee has never claimed to have seen the apes, but said there was something strange on the high slopes of the mountain. He was a member of a party that searched for Jim Carter, an experienced skier and mountaineer, who vanished on the mountain in 1950. His disappearance remains a mystery. Somebody watched. At the time, Lee was a member of the Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue Unit. He described the search for Carter as the most eerie experience I ever had. He said that every time he was cut off from the rest of the search party he felt somebody was watching me. Carter, he said, had climbed the mountain with some companions on a warm, clear Sunday. He left the group to take a picture and said he would ski to the left of the group. He was never seen again. His tracks, however, indicated that he suddenly took off down the mountain in a wild, death-defying run that no experienced skier would make, unless he was pursued, Lee said. The track went in the direction of Ape Canyon. But no trace of Carter or his equipment was found, although the area was combed for 2 weeks. Lee recalled stories of about 25 persons who claimed they had encountered the monsters during a 20-year period. The canyon named for the apes is a lonely, ominous spot in a wild area. It extends to a point near Ape Cave, thought to be the longest unitary lava tube in the world. There have been many reports of footprints in the area. Some are described as being about 18 inches long and seemingly human. Unless the creatures are really fuzzy throwbacks, the lost Indian tribe theory seems most likely to some of the fans of the mystery. It has given rise to some suggestions, one of which is to leave well enough alone. The government might take over and shove benefits and subsidies at them, retroactive to the Ice Age. And that, as well as costing a lot of money, would ruin a very good legend.
Chapter 3, Background Events. In the first chapter 1 told about the attack, and now I want to go into background and tell a little concerning our activities. They will be colorful, and from them emerge a spiritual and metaphysical understanding of the case. First of all, I hope this book does not discourage too much those interested souls who are looking and trying to solve the mystery of the abominable snowman. If someone captured one, I would have to swallow most of the content of this book, for I am about to make a bold statement. No one will ever capture one, and no one will ever kill one. In other words, present in the world a living one in a cage, or find a dead body of one to be examined by science. I know there are stories that some have been captured, but got away. So will they always get away? I say this confident by the evidence of my experiences, things that I have not before revealed to the public, and I also say it from a knowledge gained on the subject later. In this book, I will reveal thoroughly what I know them to be. First of all, I will say that they are not entirely of the world. I know the reaction we experienced as these beings attacked our cabin impressed many with the concept of great ape-like men dwelling in the mountains. And I can say that we genuinely fought and were quite fearful, and we were glad to get out of the mountains, but I was, for one, always conscious that we were dealing with supernatural beings, and I know the other members of the party felt the same. The events leading up to the ape episode were filled with the psychic element. Since a young man, I had always been clairvoyant. When just a boy, I was in the pasture playing with my bean shooter. I had bought it with some long earn coins. It had a twisted wire handle. I lost it, and as I was crying, a kindly woman came up to me and put her arms around me. I felt warm all over. "Little boy," she said, "don't cry. Go home. You will find your bean shooter there." I went home and found it, and as far as I knew, then it was the same one. But years later, I found the one I lost. It was weather-beaten, and the rubber was rotten. I would be sleeping on the hard benches of the Adventist church my folks used to attend, and I would have my head in a lady's lap. Only when I mentioned it to my folks, they said there was no one else there and took it to be a boy's musings. As I grew older, I saw visions, and eventually I was holding spiritual meetings. After 1924, I spent many years in healing work. Our time spent in MT St. Helens was a series of psychic experiences. The method we found our mind was psychic. I am mentioning these facts to help build a background of understanding in a case which has been wholly explained in a material sense, as I will explain the mysterious realities of the abominable snowmen. So must I show some of my inner experiences, for in my mind the two have always been closely connected together, and as I will show, these beings bear a direct association with the psychic realm. In 1922, we found the location of our mine. A spiritual being, a large Indian dressed in buckskin, appeared to us and talked to us. He was a picture of stateliness itself. He never told us his name, but we always called him the Great Spirit. He replied once, "The Great Spirit is above me. We are all of the Great Spirit, if we listen when the Great Spirit talks." There was another spiritual being which appeared to us, more in the role of a comforting friend, and we learned her name. One of our party suggested later that we name our mine after her, and so the mining claim we later filed bore her last name. The big Indian being told us there would be a white arrow go before us. Another man, who was not present during the attack in 1924, could see the arrow easily and clearly at all times, and I could see it nearly as well. So we started by the Lewis River, south of MT St. Helens, and went up the Muddy River, and in all we followed the white arrow 4 days. The going was slow, for in those days it was very rugged territory. Hank's temper was growing short as he climbed the hills. He had always been a believer of spiritual things, and afterwards he was a believer, but he lost his temper and cussed. He swore at the spirit leading us. His face was red and we could not stop him. "Just a wild goose chase," he exclaimed. "They lied to us and got us running all over the hills, and I want nothing more to do with them." He went on and on. Then just when it started to calm down, we all saw the arrow soar up high, change direction and swoop down. We had to follow in the general direction before we could find it again. It hovered near the top of the north cliff of Ape Canyon. That was the site where we later blasted out our shaft. We got a little closer, and we all saw the image of a large door open, and the big Indian appeared in front of it. He spoke. "Because you have cursed the spirit leading you, you will be shown where there is gold, but it is not given to you." With those words, he disappeared. Then we saw the door slowly close. There was a huge lock and latch, but as the door shut, the lock did not latch. A closed door, but it was not locked. We just as well pack up and go home, one of the party said. And that is just the way our gold mine turned out. Closed but not locked. We worked that mine for 2 years, and want to say showed well over $2,000 a ton. But as it turned out, what we had actually done was to cut the leaders. There is a pocket of gold in that cliff, if someone is fortunate enough to find it. We gave up looking for it. The picture I am trying to paint for you is a picture of manifestation. In this book, I have showed also some of our high manifestation, as we had many a high nature the 6 years we spent in the MT St. Helens area. Of course, the lower or grosser manifestations were the appearing of these hairy creatures called abominable snowmen, also called hairy apes, Bigfoot, and Sasquatch. According to the region they are seen in, I believe they have always existed, although our encounter with them in 1924 was the first major report of anyone coming in contact with them. Other writings have documented the cases very well. I just like to show the reason for their appearances. For 6 years, all have been peaceful. We were simple men and hard-working men, and an aura of good or spiritual power surrounded us. We had seen the tracks, but the makers of them had left us alone. No one was really worried about the tracks as regarding any threat to our safety. But after one of us had lost his temper and denounced the spirit leading us a liar, from that time on, a quiet apprehensiveness settled over us. We continued working our claim, but down deep we felt it would avail to no good end. We had bursts of enthusiasm, but no success. And yet we did have success because we learned. Nothing can replace experience as a teacher. There are a couple experiences which show some light or evidence on the psychic nature of abominable snowmen. The same thudding, hollow thumping noise we heard at night preceding the attack, we also had heard in broad daylight, although not nearly so loud. One of our party was a little irritated with me. On our excursions, he usually led the way and I followed a little behind the others. We kept hearing that sound, and occasionally he'd turn around and would say, "What's that?" After 6 or 8 times of him doing this, and after a few general discussions about the noise, he quickly turned around one more time and eyed me and said, "By golly, boys, it's not Fred making that noise after all." But he decided to give it a double check. He made an excuse and wandered away from camp. When he came back, he said, "Now I'm certain it's none of us." I walked for half an hour, and everywhere I went, I heard it. Sounds like there's a hollow drum in the earth somewhere and something is hitting it. There is no doubt in my mind that these beings were present and observing us, but they had not yet appeared in physical form. Another very striking experience which shows that they cannot be natural beings with natural bodies. It was before we made our cabin, and we were staying in a tent then. The tent was below a little cone-shaped mountain called Pumy Butte. A little creek flowed nearby, and there was a moist sand bar about an acre in area. We would go there and wash our cooking utensils and bring our drinking water back. Early one morning, Hank came back to the tent. He was rather excited. He led us to the moist sandbar and took us almost to the center. There in the center of the sandbar were 2 huge tracks about 4 inches deep. There was not another track on that sandbar. There we were standing in the middle of the sandbar, and not one of us could conceive any earthly thing taking steps 160 feet long. No human being could have made these tracks, Hank said, and there's only one way they could be made. Something dropped from the sky and went back up. There was no third step. This is certainly another indication of what I'm saying about manifestation. I have heard it said that many ages ago the Rocky Mountain and Cascade Mountain ranges were a center of a great civilization. I do think the mountain areas are extra sensitive to spiritual vibration, usually of a higher order, but sometimes lower. We ourselves being extra sensitive to spiritual vibration probably had come into contact with the manifestation of these being easier than, perhaps, the average person would have. On the subject of the snowmen, I am not going to say masters told me this or that. It would perhaps look impressive, but I want to keep the record straight. Masters have appeared in our home and talked with us, but not once do I recall asking them anything on the subject. Since that day in 1924, I have went on and progressed and have learned much, and now I can look back and put the puzzle together from the reservoir of knowledge I have learned. In the true sense, everything in the material world is a manifestation. Ever since the time the first essence of consciousness formed from the great void, we cannot describe. Different planes or dimensions of being were created or manifested. Occasionally, we of this dimension of space can be conscious of other beings of a different vibration and consciousness. But the abominable snowmen are from the lower plane. When the conditioned vibration is at a certain frequency, they can easily, for a time, appear in a very solid body. They are not animal spirits, but also lack the intelligence of a human consciousness. When reading of evolution, we have read many times conjecture about the missing link between man and the anthropoid ape. The snowmen are a missing link in consciousness, neither animal nor human. They are very closed out dimension, and yet are a part of one lower. Could they be the missing link man has been so long searching for? The human soul once dwelled in a spiritual body, and eventually incarnated at the fall of man into bodies like we have now. The beings we call abominable snowmen were not of the necessary high development to incarnate in human form. They had not reached that scale of spiritual evolution. They are the easiest beings materialized, as evidenced by the many reports of their appearances to more people in recent years. In fact, if the vibratory influence right for them is present, they can manifest without any human being present at all. This accounts for the many tracks being seen along the mountain ranges of the West Coast and Canada. When this age or cycle of life that we are in moves on eventually to a higher cycle, and all life moves forward, these beings may stay and move up in consciousness in some other world in the far distant future. Perhaps the ape beings will toil the road of intelligence in that world which none of us can even imagine, and perhaps they too will lose nothing and gain by their experience. Most theories picture the snowmen as material beings hiding in caves and scampering over the mountains. The law of probability would be that eventually one would be found if their bodies were a physical construction only. If one claims only the physical laws to explain their existence, then we can use material logic to prove or disprove the premise. If they are material life, definite material evidence would surely be found. What material evidence we do have, in my opinion, which I believe firmly to be true, only shows material extrances into this plane, followed by the supernatural exits back into their own realm. I and my companions have shot them, but could find no trace of them. If they were material life like we know it to be on this globe, one would die naturally or accidentally and the remains be found. The easy way out for lots of people is to just consider a wild tale, but too many people have seen them, and the evidence is piling up to definitely prove this. The same line of escapism of thought concerning phenomenal sightings of flying saucers is evident. A report recently showed 5 million Americans claim to have seen flying saucers. Material things usually make a big splash in the material world, and spiritual things often do not make a ripple there. Why? We can give proof of a phenomenon, but its nature is immersed in the spiritual, and can only be explained by laws of the spiritual. But these happenings that seem strange to people are serving a very useful purpose. It is causing more people to think, and that is a path in the right direction. The abominable snowmen are just one small mystery among many. Someday, more people will conceive that the greatest proportion of life is a mystery, and he will seek and find solutions to them, and then the mysteries will be unveiled in their pure forms, and from that unveiling man will find greater life. Manifestation is made possible by vibration of power and certain fine substances. Beings manifested can be seen, heard, and take a definite form, sometimes less tangible, but also, under other conditions, take a very tangible form. I want to tell you a very amazing experience I had in my mining days at MT St. Helens. I was walking from Spirit Lake on the trail. It was in the afternoon, and I was feeling a little lonely. As I came around a curve in the trail, I met a very pleasant, beautiful young lady. She began talking with me just as though she had always known me and had casually met me again. She said her father was hunting and that she was headed back to her camp. She had a jacket with her, and she let me pack it as we walked along the trail together. She told me all about herself and her father, stating that she and her father came up every summer for an outing, to hunt, and to enjoy the beauties of nature. She was one of the most pleasant persons I had ever talked to in my life. When we parted, she told me where she and her father were camped and asked me to visit them that evening. I went and had to walk about a mile. Her camp was east of ours, and quite a distance for a young lady of 18, I thought, to wander around and away from her father. When I arrived at her camp, I did not see her father and never did see him. She had a fire going, and a light-colored blanket was spread out, and she was sitting on it. It was a warm summer evening, and we held another pleasant conversation. I remember her telling me how she liked the fresh air of the mountains and how wonderfully she loved nature. She would be talking on a subject, then pause and say, "Isn't that right, Dad?" This she said several times. There was no tent, cooking utensils, no food, and certainly no visible father. The most amazing thing was I did not at the time think her different than any other person. When she spoke to her invisible dad, I felt just like her dad was there. I left her and walked back to camp, but my mind seemed like it was 1,000 miles away. I could hear the other men talking, but it seemed like they were below me, and their voices sounded soft and distant. I did not know anyone who had seen her but myself. One day we needed a pencil to make a description of our claim. We found we had not brought one along with us. Everyone was a little put out, but then it came. A pencil was in my hand. It had tooth marks all over it. When that trip was over and I was home, I showed the pencil to my wife, and she said, "Why? That's a pencil I bought when you were gone. How did you get it?" She said my oldest son, then a young tot, was chewing on it, and she took it away from him and had put it in a drawer. She went and looked, and she found no pencil. It is a time for the world to pick up its ears about the subject of psychic phenomenon, and this more people are doing. But if there's phenomenon, there's also a world from which its qualities are manifested. Chapter 5. Theories on the origin of abominable snowmen. When I wrote of the psychic nature of these beings, I showed how people had come to see them. The manifestation takes place as a result of an energized substance surrounding these beings. To what degree the average person sighting them has a part in this, I am not prepared to say. But I do know that some persons who are psychic have a degree of involvement in a sighting and help trigger phenomenon. Now, for a little while, let us look backward in time and consider the origin of abominable snowmen, as we are departing from our understanding of what we know them to be today, and are going back infinitely in time. We are looking into a past land unexplored except by a few adept ones. I received this glimpse of time by inspiration, but present it to you as a theory, for such it has to be. A man would be a fool if he stated such intangible explorations to be absolute fact. But an exploration is a starting point right or wrong in its conclusions. Someone may challenge it by presenting a better concept, or add to it, or take a little away. So let us look back many thousands of years in time. Before man incarnated in a physical body, the earth was much different than it is today. The air had much moisture, and you and I of today would not have been able to breathe it. Strange creatures were roaming the earth and flying through the air. These creatures were all intermingled, many kinds of materiality. Some were conscious of the other, and some were not conscious of the other. The appearance of these creatures was such that we could only call them monstrosities. Some of these imperfect creatures slowly died out, or their kind of materialities ceased to exist in the same form and changed and went back into the universal source. Their form of consciousness incarnated again ages later in a higher life, namely primitive animal life. In the case of others of a different construction, they evolved into nature spirits. Some retained their nature, changing very slowly, and remain on lower planes. The beings we are considering in this book had their origin in this period of great chaos, evolving very slowly to their present nature. I do not wish to go beyond this point, and so let us return to the present. I have found that most Indians know more about abominable snowmen than one white man in 1,000. After the incident in 1924, I visited a dentist to have a tooth pulled. It was a little town in eastern Washington. As I was coming out of the dentist's office, a man came up to me and asked, "Are you the man who I read about in the papers who was attacked by ape men?" I told him I was. "Could you come with me?" he asked. "There is someone who would like to talk with you." He took me to a tavern where he introduced me to 10 or 12 Yakima Indians. They wanted to make sure I was the man, and when they were, and after asking me some questions, they told me about the Celtiques, the name by which they knew the abominable snowmen. They said the Indians knew about them, but white men never believed the tales of Indians. They said they were very careful never to go where they knew them to be, and if they ever found themselves in their presence, they were doubly careful not to offend them. "If you ever harm one, they will get even," one Indian said. "They never forget." They told me the Celtiques migrated into Canada, and in fact traveled the mountain ranges nearly to Mexico. One of their favorite methods of traveling was floating down rivers at night, like logs. They told tales about them running away with squaws. When I asked them what they were, they replied, not like a man and not like a spirit, but in between. One Indian, who must have been pretty well educated, said, "They have not come out of evolution." With all the profound sightings reported, it is probable that many sightings remain unreported. A friend of mine was fishing. He strung a number of trout on a stick and laid them on a rock. He walked downstream and waded out into the river to continue his fishing. A little later, he looked back and saw one of the hairy creatures picking up a string of fish. He was thrashing them against the rock. Some other friends were camped in the area. One morning they awoke to find their fire was scattered along the trail for a quarter mile. Once a friend and his wife saw an 8-man on the main road leading to Spirit Lake, Washington. He looked as though he was basking in the afternoon sun about 70 yards from the road. When his wife saw it, she began screaming. Then my friend said, "The thing just got up and walked away." I have told him my past experiences and have tried to explain about the present sightings. What does the future hold regarding the phenomenon of abominable snowmen? Perhaps some psychic will enter into their investigation. He will probably keep records and have reliable witnesses to observe his work and to report his findings to the world. Sightings of abominable snowmen have been reported at various times from every major continent. They were of different appearances and sizes, and the records of them date back many years. Is there an interrelated race of these beings awaiting their proper day of evolution? I am of the opinion that evolution is not only a law of the material world, but also the law of all the worlds we cannot perceive by the medium of our 5 senses. Everything seen and unseen is life, and all life is progressive and changing. Are these beings even now evolving by stages into a higher consciousness? Could they, indeed, be the missing link between man and the anthropoid, a link between material life and immaterial life? Will these beings who are wandering the earth today, and who present a weird image to us now, someday, some distant age from now, evolve into the noble ranks of human intelligence? The answer to these questions cannot be answered by expeditions. It can only come by man knowing more about his true self and more about the universe in which he dwells. Science has reached near perfection in material knowledge, but has reached a borderland through which no finite intellect can pass. All life can be studied, but man will have to look into himself to tap a spiritual power and realize the spiritual laws and reason with a spiritual mind. Man will have to break the little material shell he has around himself, which says this far you can only go and there is nothing more. What is outside that shell is pure life, and it is even above and of an higher order than material life, though material and spiritual life would work in harmony if we would let it work. I have lived this experience with abominable snowmen. I have encountered them on the slopes of empty St. Helens. I have looked deep into myself to tell you of their nature. I have had both the earthly experience of encountering them by Ape Canyon and the spiritual experience of knowing and telling what they are. I have walked through the messy cliffs of Ape Canyon and seen a primeval loneliness, reminiscent of life as it must have been years ago. I have explored the distant future, which beckons to us with hope. I have told you my story, and it is true. Abominable snowmen are a part of the creation. Will we hear much more from them? Will their habitat change from selected mountains to nearer our populous cities? I think they will. They are just one little mystery from the ocean of mysteries.